Hollow Creek, a small town in Pennsylvania, was quiet and surrounded by dense forests. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where life was simple and uneventful. But in the fall of 1993, something happened that shook the entire community. A series of events so bizarre and horrifying that even the strongest skeptics couldn't explain them. It all started when Amy Carter, a 34-year-old school teacher, inherited her late grandmother's house on the outskirts of town. The house was old, isolated, and sat at the edge of the woods by Hollow Creek. Amy had fond memories of visiting her grandmother as a child, but as she stepped into the house after so many years, she felt uneasy. The house smelled of damp wood and something faintly metallic. The walls were covered in old, faded wallpaper, and the air inside was heavy, almost oppressive. Among her grandmother's belongings, Amy found a diary. Most of it contained mundane entries about daily life, but toward the last pages, the handwriting became shaky and erratic. The entries mentioned shadows in the woods, whispering voices, and something following her. Amy dismissed it as the ramblings of an old woman slipping into dementia. She put the diary away and decided to renovate the house to move in. The first night Amy stayed in the house, she was awoken by strange noises. It sounded like someone was walking on the porch, slow, deliberate steps. Thinking it might be an animal, she turned on the porch light, but there was nothing there. She went back to bed, trying to convince herself it was just her imagination. But the footsteps returned the next night, and the night after that. One evening, while sitting on the couch reading, Amy heard a faint tapping sound coming from the window. She froze, her heart pounding. Gathering her courage, she pulled back the curtain. There was no one there, but the glass was fogged as if someone had been breathing on it. Her unease grew with each passing day, but she tried to rationalize everything. A week later, Amy decided to explore the woods behind the house. She remembered playing there as a child but hadn't been back in years. As she walked deeper into the forest, she noticed how unnaturally quiet it was. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just silence. Then she saw something that made her blood run cold, a small clearing with strange symbols carved into the trees. In the center of the clearing was a pile of old, rotting animal bones. Amy felt an overwhelming sense of being watched. She quickly turned back, but as she hurried toward the house, she swore she heard whispers, soft, indistinct voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. When she reached the house, she locked the door and decided she wouldn't go back into those woods again. The next day, a neighbor named Jim stopped by. He was an older man who had lived in Hollow Creek his entire life. When Amy mentioned the clearing, his face turned pale. He told her to stay out of the woods, saying, "There's something wrong with that place. People have seen things out there, shadows that move on their own. You should leave while you can." That night, Amy heard the footsteps again, but this time they were inside the house. She grabbed a flashlight and tiptoed through the dark hallways, her heart racing. As she turned a corner, she saw it, a tall, dark figure standing at the end of the hallway. It had no face, just a black, featureless void where its head should have been. She screamed, and the figure vanished into thin air. The next day, Amy called the local sheriff, but there wasn't much he could do. There were no signs of forced entry, and he chalked it up to stress or a bad dream. Amy knew what she saw was real, but she felt helpless. Desperate for answers, Amy revisited her grandmother's diary. One entry stood out: "The shadow watches from the woods. It wants something, but I don't know what. It followed me home last night. I can feel it, always there, just out of sight." Amy began researching the history of the house and the surrounding area. She discovered that several people had gone missing in the woods over the years, their bodies never found. Locals believed the woods were cursed, but no one knew why. One stormy night, As rain lashed against the windows, Amy felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The lights flickered, and then the power went out. She lit a candle and sat in the living room, clutching a kitchen knife for protection. Suddenly, the air grew icy cold. She saw her breath fog in front of her. Then she heard it, the whispering. It was louder now, closer. She turned toward the hallway and saw the shadow figure again, but this time it was moving toward her. Its form seemed to ripple and shift as it glided silently across the floor. Amy screamed and threw the knife, but it passed through the figure as if it were smoke. The shadow lunged at her, and she felt a searing pain in her chest, as if something was pulling the air from her lungs. Just when she thought she was going to die, the front door burst open. Jim stood there, holding a Bible and shouting prayers. The shadow let out an ear-piercing screech and disappeared. Jim explained that the house had a dark history. In the 1800s, a cult had used the woods for rituals, summoning something they couldn't control. That something was tied to the land and the house. Jim performed a cleansing ritual, but he warned Amy that the shadow might never truly leave. Amy sold the house and moved back to the city, but she was never the same. She avoided dark places and never stayed alone at night. Years later, the house was abandoned, and no one dared to buy it. Locals say they still see strange lights in the woods and hear whispers when they walk too close to Hollow Creek. To this day, Amy swears her story is true, and she has the scars, both physical and emotional, to prove it.